Our world has become a simulation, one of Jean Baudrillard's many bold but intriguing claims. But what does he mean by this? Does he mean that we're living in a matrix computer simulation of ones and zeros, or are we stuck in Plato's cave, where we see only an abstraction of the real world, where what we see is not really real? It's actually neither. Instead, Baudrillard develops a new idea of simulation, relevant to our current postmodern world, from roughly the late 20th century to the present day, in which the world is made up of signs or images which reflect other signs rather than the real world. But what does this mean exactly? What even is a sign? Let's go through the 4 phases of the sign or image to better understand what is meant by Baudrillard's perplexing definition of simulation. Note that these stages are partly historical, evolving along with certain historical epochs, but they also each pervade the present day. However, as we shall see, we are heading towards a point of no return, where our whole reality becomes stuck in the 4th and final phase of the image. But first, phase 1 of the simulation. This is where the image in question is the reflection of a basic reality. This is a very basic form of simulation, hardly even a simulation at all. In this case, we still know exactly what is real and what has been simulated. The sign seems authentic as it clearly reflects its real-life equivalent. For example, old paintings, those done before the Romantic period of history, the camera obscura, webcam video, unedited video recordings, as these are faithful to the original moment, and travel photos uploaded to TripAdvisor. Now, phase 2, the second stage of simulation, but the first of simulacra. Here, the image in question masks and denatures basic reality. It's a kind of counterfeited adaptation of reality, usually with some secret intended purpose for it or some spin on the basic facts of reality. Baudrillard says that the sign takes an evil appearance, and this is the order of maleficence, as the image is no longer a faithful copy of the original. For example, paintings, such as religious ones or romantic ones, which are idealized, everything is made to seem perfect, but the referent here is still obvious. Video filters on Zoom, for example, putting a political spin on the content of Donald Trump, for example, CNN or Fox News. Food being advertised as having a particular flavour. For example, smoky BBQ sauce was almost definitely not actually smoked, but it still has that flavour. Official photos on a travel company's website are likely to be slightly distorted and idealised slightly. And a basic map of the territory, which is quite the key example which we'll come back to. For example, labelling towns and cities and hills and rivers. The names are constructed for our convenience, but they don't actually exist in reality. This phase developed in the early modern period of human history, where there began to arise a competition of signs. For example, who could produce the best sign or simulation? The one most appealing. For example, the most romantic or idealized or perfect work of art. This is the stage where things stop trying to be an accurate reflection of reality. And this is indicative of the first stage of simulacra. So we can think of simulacra as a particular type of simulation which is not an accurate reflection of a basic reality. It puts some spin on the original. It's the first example of where we are simulating a simulation. All of the examples above are examples of the first basic stage of simulacra. Okay, so phase 3 now. This is where the image in question marks the absence of a basic reality, where there are signs which claim to represent reality, but they are merely copies where the original reference doesn't even exist. For example, mass-produced cars, clothes, furniture, shoes, all of these things which circulate the world. Copies of books that circulate libraries around the world and people's bookshelves. Fire drills in schools, where we pretend that this particular sign is referring to some original referent, a real fire, which doesn't actually exist. Another weird example is GIFs made on the internet, for example, of Donald Trump. And these GIFs, they circle the internet endlessly. This phase emerged in the modern period of history, from around the Industrial Revolution. So, for example, with mass-produced cars, it's impossible for us to distinguish any copies of the car from the real, original, first make of the car. The copies aren't counterfeits or fakes, like they kind of were in phase 2 of the simulation. Instead, all of the copies are just as real as the original. So, since there's no distinction between the real original and any of its copies, we can hardly say there exists a basic, fundamental reality with original reference from which the copy is based. In other words, there is an absence of basic reality. A defining feature of this phase is that it's not obvious to us what is real and what is a copy or simulation of the original. Here, a slippery slope begins where two things are starting to happen. First, we start to commodify objects and images. This is different to an unalienated society which is not a victim of simulation. These unalienated societies, as Baudrillard calls them, partake not in simulation but in something else, which he calls symbolic exchange, something which we'll cover more in depth in a future video. The second thing that starts to happen in this third phase of the image is that we start to lose touch with what is real and what is a simulation. For example, our focus shifts away from real events, for example, facing tragedy in the world or how to respond to people in need. It shifts from this to focusing on objects. Since we have started taking them so seriously, these objects and images and simulations become our basis of reality. Those are the things that we think are real, more so than what is actually going on in the outside world around us. We become too invested in our newfound interest in mass-produced objects and content and signs. Now, phase 4 occurs when the image in question bears no resemblance to reality whatsoever. It is its own pure simulacrum. And remember what we said about simulacrum. It is a distorted adaptation of reality. But here in the fourth phase, it's not a distorted adaptation of reality, but a distorted adaptation of another sign or simulacrum. Distortions upon distortions, a kind of dizziness of distortions. Here are lots of examples from this phase. Virtual reality is an obvious one, where a whole world is created out of self-referential signs. For example, immersing oneself in a new world with new reference to simulated places and your own simulated avatar, which has its own clothes, which are replicas of a real thing but digitalized, and some goal or journey that this character has which is arbitrary in the real world, but it only has meaning and relation with respect to the other signs and images in the virtual reality game. We can see there's a whole cacophony of signs relating to other signs in the whole entire system of signs. The basic reality is so far removed that it is practically forgotten. Another example is films like Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park. The image here of the dinosaurs is pure simulacrum. Baudrillard provides the example of where the map precedes and so becomes the territory. This is where Baudrillard gets the title of his first chapter of his book, Simulation and Simulacra, which is entitled Precession of Simulacra. It's where simulacra have taken over the forefront of our minds and they determine how we perceive reality and how reality actually turns out. In this case, with the map preceding the territory, the lines drawn on the map, that shapes what reality becomes. It's hardly considered what the reality of the actual territory is, but instead what's considered is just what is convenient to the map drawers and the people in charge. For example, a lot of the states in America and the border between America and Canada is just a perfectly straight line. No consideration of the actual geographic location, more just what was convenient when the maps were being drawn up. In this case, we take the simulation to be real and forget that there was even a basic reality to be considered in the first place. Another example is that of God. This is an interesting example as it's probably the first and most earliest case of phase 4 simulation that's pervaded a lot of human history. Although whether or not it is phase 4 depends on one's framing and one's perspective. From a secular viewpoint, it certainly is phase 4, but religious people would not take it to be. In the past, God was seen as the base reality. We created symbols and signs about him. This religious viewpoint matches Baudrillard's earlier phases of the image. But in the modern secular day, we do not make this assumption that God is the basic, original referent of reality. What we see now from a secular standpoint is that God was never anything but the signs that make him up, that literally make him up, according to a secular viewpoint. The signs of God have no relation to reality, as religious societies previously thought. The iconoclasts were a very interesting group which forbade the use of religious imagery, symbolism and icons in the temples, as they thought that the divinity of nature can never be represented. Baudrillard writes that the iconoclasts, who forbade religious imagery and icons in the church, were the first to recognise the dangerous power of signs, where other religious sects came to revere these signs and images more than the actual reality and divinity behind them. Baudrillard writes that the iconoclasts predicted this omnipotence of simulacra, the faculty simulacra have of effacing God from the conscience of man and the destructive truth they allow to appear. That deep down God never existed, that only the simulacrum ever existed, even that God himself was never anything but his own simulacrum. Their recognition of the power of signs in deluding and distracting us from the truth is where their urge to destroy the images came from. Because of this, they did not get wrapped up in any deeper stages of simulations, and arguably from a Christian standpoint, they got a more real, closer connection to God as a result of this. Another example of Phase 4 is Disneyland. Here, a whole world of objects and signs is created from other objects and signs and images in the Disney franchise. Disneyland is full of signs referencing signs, totally distinct from any base reality under it. It is its own pure simulacrum, as Baudrillard would say. Another thing with Disneyland is that it's seen as this magical, imaginary world, totally distinct from the real America outside of it. This creates the illusion that the rest of America is real and serious, not simulated like Disneyland. But this is far from the truth. It causes us to believe the simulations that constitute America even more. Some more examples are AI artworks and video games. Recently, I found the Minecraft trailer quite an interesting thing, where people have created their own AI trailer, a dark fantasy one, for example. And Minecraft itself is obviously a simulation with some basic reference to a real world, but obviously heavily distorted. But with these trailers and videos, they refer back to this other simulation. So here we've created a simulation of a simulation. But it seems that some simulations, like this dark fantasy trailer of Minecraft, we preferred that one over the original one. So what is happening is we start to navigate this world of signs, and that our tastes and preferences are so mixed up with signs and simulations that the basic reality underneath them is completely lost. Our whole framework for navigating the world and what we like and desire and what we prefer is more geared to what simulations appeal to us, rather than any interest in a real world underneath it all. Memes are another big example of Phase 4 of the image. So memes kind of used to be related to the real world, but now they are so weird and distorted and self-referential. It's like a whole universe, a whole language of memes has developed which pervades the internet. A silly example that I got from Reddit is Trump as Pepe the Frog. There are so many other memes too which reside in this final phase of simulation. With these memes, there's basically no more reference to any real world underneath it. It's all kind of self-contained and a self-referential system of signs referring to other signs, referring to simulations, referring to images, where the reality has just become lost. Another example of Phase 4 is designer shoes as a status symbol. This is where Phase 3 becomes elevated to the point where these images and objects develop an extra meaning in relation to other objects. For example, limited edition Nike trainers or designer shoes are taken to be a real reflection of oneself, one's character and one's standing or personality. Phase 3 is concerned more with functionality. Phase 4 is where status and one's image becomes a priority, where the signs take on meaning in relation to other signs, not in relation to a basic reality, like in Phase 1 or 2. The last example we'll look at is that of culture. So reality is made up of cultural representations everywhere. So when we make new bits of culture, they inevitably are going to reference other bits of culture. And before we know it, we're making copies of copies. We're referencing signs with other signs and so on. Reality is not based on an original referent anymore. It's based on copies and other signs that already exist in this system of signs and images that has developed over the past few decades. Family Guy does this a lot. So Family Guy usually references real-world events, which are themselves simulations. But because Family Guy itself is its own simulation, it's a simulation of a simulation, and quite often Family Guy will reference itself, and there's simulation upon simulation upon simulation, and it can just endlessly get deeper and deeper into these simulations built upon each other. To summarize, phase 4 is where signs simulate other signs, and we get so lost in them, we take the signs to be real. The signs are more important to us than the things they represent or any underlying basic reality. The signs are what have meaning. The signs are what we invest in and spend time chasing. We forget that there ever existed a real world without them. So what's all the point of this? Why have we spent so long talking about signs? Because with an obsession over signs, two very dangerous things are happening with our postmodern society. First, the distinction between reality and simulations is being lost. This is something Baudrillard calls the implosion of meaning. And the second dangerous thing that is occurring is that the hyperreal is taking over, and we often prefer simulations to reality. But this is how an awareness of simulation and simulacra can help. Understanding the workings behind these social phenomena make it possible to counter them as individuals, to not be manipulated by them and to see through them. We begin to come back to what is authentically ours, to see what we really desire, and we start to recognize what desires and meanings are subconsciously programmed into us by the simulations that surround us. For example, we start to recognize all the simulations on reality TV or on Instagram telling us what the real world supposedly looks like, what relationships look like, what love looks like, what happiness looks like, what joy looks like, what success looks like. But we don't have to be molded by these simulations, by what we see on the internet or on TV, because we can start to see through it. We don't let the simulations determine reality for us. More will be said on this on a future video about hyper-reality, on how we prefer simulations over the real thing. Being aware of what a simulation is on a basic level and how it evolves may be able to help us as individuals and as a society in recognizing simulations early, recognizing their potential power, and returning to the real beneath them, not getting too wrapped up in the simulations. An understanding of science and simulations allows us to understand what the real world is. What is reality? What does the real refer to? By considering what it is not, we can better understand what it is. Baudrillard thinks we can define reality in a negative sense. Reality is that which cannot be simulated and is not simulated, something which is hard to come by these days. In a future video, we'll cover more on what Baudrillard thinks reality is, what a real event is, and whether it's possible for us to return to the real world, whether this is something that's possible or even something that we want. Hopefully you found this video useful, dissecting the notions of simulation and simulacra. A lot more can be said on this topic, but now we have a basic understanding of Baudrillard's main ideas, we can go a lot deeper into his other ideas and theories. Thank you very much for watching, and see you soon.